My lords here, my lords here present, Leonard Six, seniors and colleagues. My name is Damlola Victoria Alabi, the Secretary of the MBA Section on Legal Practice, Technology, Media, and Telecommunications Committee. Thank you for joining us once again on another session of the MBA SLP TMT webinar series. We are glad that you made the time to join us again this afternoon. This afternoon, we're having a very crucial and important conversation. This afternoon, we are talking about how to build AI governance into AI strategy. And today, I am particularly delighted to be welcoming our hosts, our guests for today, apologies, Ms. Toulu Akerele. We will be starting right away for want of time. Ms. Tolu Akerele, FIP, CIPPE, CIPM, AIGP, is the Global Data Protection Officer and AI Governance Lead at Paystack. She's the CEO and founder at TAS Cyber Solutions Limited. Once again, Ms. Akerele, you're welcome on the call. Okay, your mic is still
Good
muted.
afternoon.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Yes. Um, so esteemed participants, just a few housekeeping rules. You can leave your comments and questions in the chat box. We'll come back to that in the course of the conversation from time to time. And secondly, there'll be no need for you to type in your Supreme Court numbers, emails, and other personal identifiers because you will not be needing that. Everything we need to process your CPD certificate was collected already at the point of registration. Thank you so much. Thank you. So today the conversation is going to be a question and answer style. There will be no slides to present, and that's largely because over time we've had several conversations on AI for lawyers. And for those who are probably joining us for the first time, the MBA section on legal practice, the MBA generally, has guideline on the use of AI for lawyers. So you can check the NBASLP website for that. We also have guidelines on the use of technology on cybersecurity. These are guidelines that are in line with the provisions of the RPC and will guide your practice as you engage the use of artificial intelligence. Thank you once again. All right, so we're delving straight into the conversation. Now, my first question to you, Ms. Akerele, is that over time, many organizations treat AI governance as a compliance checkbox rather than a strategic function. From your experience at Paystack, how do you embed governance into AI strategy from the ground up, not as an afterthought?
Great question. Thank you. I mean, first, you really have to, like with anything, start with leadership buy-in. So you need to really look at the leaders in your organization that are passionate about AI, that are building with AI, that want to roll AI out company-wide to boost productivity and partner with them. That's the first step, I would say, top down, because it's leadership that will run the AI strategy. It's leadership that will either overlook or buy into AI governance. So you need to secure those stakeholders as a starting point. I think next, as with most things, compliance or governance related, you need to build that culture. And when AI is the new hot topic, it's what everyone wants to use for their work to push out AI products. But I think there's a difference between AI as a new shiny toy and AI and responsible use of AI as a culture. So I think building that culture of ethical AI, responsible AI use within the company is very critical to establishing a governance program. And when you look at ethical AI, you will need obviously legal and compliance to be there. And they'll help with things like policies and procedures. So that will be maybe the documentation will be covered by legal and compliance, right? Making sure that bias isn't there, it's inclusive. Then you also want to make sure from the design phase, there's diversity even as you're designing whether to deploy AI or develop AI. So what that means is if you have 10 men in a room, all maybe from the same ethnic group, there's not a lot of diversity when you're looking at the design. Let's say the 10 men in the group from northern Nigeria of a certain ethnic group are tasked of building a product on with AI to market female hygiene products. Obviously, there's not a lot of diversity of thought. So when we talk about equitable design, it's also just making sure from each stage there is diversity, because bias can be built into the design of even how you want to use AI. Of course, as we know, most of your lawyers, there's privacy and cybersecurity that needs to be considered. So you've got legal and compliance for things like IP, for things like policy documentation, governance frameworks. You have the diversity of thought when you're designing and building. And then you also want to cater to privacy and cybersecurity. We know how closely privacy, data protection, and AI governance are tied. And then finally, I would say to get started with your governance program, the last thing you should look to consider is data governance. So you need to make sure that the quality and integrity of your data that you're either training models with or developing models with is of a high quality and has been governed appropriately. Because anything you input that is trash will give an output of trash. So I would say that's the starting point. Buy-in from leadership, making sure you've got cross-functional stakeholders to help you build that culture of ethical AI. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That was a very, very, very detailed response. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. And I hope that our participants are getting real value for their time. Once again, for those who are just joining, you can leave your comments and questions in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on it and keep visiting it from time to time. All right. So my next question to you is this. Where does, I know you kind of mentioned it in the course of answering the last question, where does AI governance end and where does data protection begin? Are they complementary or is it conflicting in any way? Does it create conflicts for the practitioners in any way?
That's a great question. And I think those who are data protection practitioners and professionals and actually operationalize data protection and privacy compliance will find AI governance and compliance with emerging laws an easier field to navigate. So I'll start with the areas of convergence or where you'll see similarities or how your privacy knowledge will help you with AI governance. So transparency. Transparency in AI, we call it interpretability or explainability, right? So that's things like having a model card or a system card, explaining what the model does, explaining the potential harm if you misuse it, explaining how it was built, tested for bias, all these things. That's model card. So a model card is almost the equivalent of a privacy policy. You're telling people how and why you process their personal data. So transparency is a concept that I think is continuous for both privacy and AI governance. This notion of choice and lawful basis, people have to be able to have choices with AI. And we can look at this in terms of maybe automated decision making, right? So you should be able to agree or disagree with the use of your data for in AI systems. So some of that is, when you ask your LLM to opt out of training on your data, that's a notion of choice, right? And when I say lawful basis, of course, it's the same concept. There has to be a lawful legal basis to process personal data. I'll just quickly skim over the others, which I'm sure we know. Purpose limitation, data minimization, collection limitation, privacy by design. These are all very important when you're talking about AI governance. So making sure, of course, especially with AI, that when you're designing and developing and deploying AI systems or AI tools, that you're building in privacy from the beginning. If you don't need to have the model train on personal data, don't include it. if you need certain personal data, keep personal data that is absolutely necessary for the specific purpose of processing within the AI system, right? So, there are things like pseudonymization you can use, encryption, all these and various privacy enhancing technologies that can help with that privacy by design. Now, if you want to look at where data protection legislation and AI governance separate, or maybe it's a bit trickier, it's when we look at things like data subject access requests, data subject rights requests. I'm so sorry, it's been a long day. But that's where you'll start to see it's not as easy to delete someone's data if you've used it in your AI system, or maybe decoupling it from someone else's personal data. So when you start talking about things like deletion, restriction of processing, objection, it's a lot more complex to translate that traditional privacy right into the context of emerging technology, specifically AI. So it's really complex to apply these rights on AI systems that maybe are trained on data sets that that system no longer holds or can even access, right? If your LLM is training on data, you can't necessarily pinpoint the moment in which it trained on certain data, and much less who that person's data is, who the data subject is. So you have automated decision making, right, from a data protection legislation perspective, but it doesn't necessarily translate when you're trying to put in a human in the loop with AI. In some circumstances, you need that automated decision making. So I think I'll just stop there because
Yes.
yeah, I can talk forever, sorry.
No, no problem. Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, I can see that you're speaking from a lot of depth. And I hope that our participants really can see through that and follow through on the conversation as we go on. Once again, you can leave your questions and comments in the chat box, and because of the conversation, we'll visit it from time to time. Now, for I know there are people on the call who are wondering, okay, I know we've mentioned the word AI governance like I don't know how many times in the last couple of minutes since we started. Someone is probably wondering, what does an AI governance look like? What does an AI governance framework look like in a fintech company? Because I'm bringing it to fintech because of your background. Say how, what does it look like, for a fintech company that probably spans multiple African jurisdictions, with varying or absent specific legislations. So how do you build a framework with that?
Um, it's easy and difficult at the same time because AI governance and laws around AI are not really solidified across the continent. There are frameworks, there are AI action plans in various countries that have put out. I know Kenya has one, Ghana has an AI governance strategy. So they have different frameworks and strategies. Nigeria has the bill where AI is discussed, but there's no equivalent to the EU AI Act, for example, or what we see in South Korea with the Basic AI Act. We don't have anything as robust as that. So it's easy because you don't necessarily have to comply with an overarching law, but then it's tricky because of the regulated industry. There are certain AI touch points, whether it's come from CBN circulars where they tell you what you can and can't do with AI, or what they expect you to do in terms of transaction monitoring or due diligence and making sure everything is run through one specific system. So I think the way we've approached it at Paystack is to first and foremost make sure we are aligning with industry best practice, both within the fintech industry and within the AI industry and emerging technology, and making sure that we're benchmarking against what is appropriate use and responsible development with AI, and then making sure the financial specific regulations, and of course you have in the guide, there's a whole section on emerging technologies and AI and personal data. So we look at the intersection of those jurisdiction-specific and industry-specific legislations, and we go for the strictest requirements and make sure we're in alignment with that.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So what I'm getting from that is that it's both simple and it's both difficult. Simple because you don't have the strictest of rules to stick to. At the same time, you're expected there are sector-specific, industry-specific requirements that you have to comply with, and which may be quite stringent at times. So yeah, but compliance is still needed, especially as we look into the possibility. I know there's the National Assembly is having conversations about having an AI policy at some AI law or some document at some point, and we're hoping that that comes into fruition soonest. Because I've always believed that law is a tool for social engineering. You live an area of the human life outside the purview of the law, and there's a lot of abuses and things like that could happen there. So yep. So I'm just going to go into the next question. And my next question to you is this. When a business unit wants to deploy an AI tool very quickly, because I know there are, on the call, we have law firm owners who probably also want to deploy AI in their practice or who advise business entities on the deployment of AI. And the governance process says slow down. How do you resolve the tension between the law becoming a bottleneck to innovation and an enabler? Because for some builders, they look at you and say, oh, law literally stifles innovation. By the time you're done checking all the boxes, you run out of creative juice and you almost don't want to build anymore. So how do you resolve that?
Yeah, it's actually funny. Our legal team at Paystack made a shirt that says legal is not the blocker because it's very often the notion you get that, oh, legal and compliance are here to say no, no, no. So they made t-shirts that says legal is not the blocker. But to answer your question, I think whenever you're even looking at deploying AI, and this is something that I've learned through experience, what's the risk, right? First, look at what's the use case and what's the risk of this use case, and can this use case for deploying AI be done without AI? If so, let's do it. If not, what's the risk of using AI? And what do I mean by that? We're a heavily regulated company. We're in a heavily regulated industry. If somebody wants to use AI as a spell checker, or they want to use AI to build a client deck or some kind of presentation, it's a minimal risk. It's a minimal risk if there's no personal data involved. It's a minimal risk if this is an enterprise tool, so all the data stays within Paystack. It doesn't go for further training to improve other models. So enterprise version, no personal data. And thirdly, no Paystack proprietary data. So no source code, no trade secrets, no Paystack proprietary data owned by the company. Now, if you take all those three things into consideration, you can see that deploying a tool is now not really a problem because you're not putting the company's data at risk. You're not putting the data of individuals at risk of breach. And this data is not going to be used to train, and it doesn't really even leave our, excuse me, environment. It's like if you have a corporate cloud, right? Are you going to take out a free Gmail or Google Workspace license, or will you pay for an enterprise version and put seats and put everyone in the company on that enterprise plan? It's the same concept. And I think where you will see tension is if maybe somebody wants to deploy a tool to do something quickly and build something fast and dirty, and they don't want you to be asking these questions. And if it's not enterprise and they just want to test it and they want to put code in, etc., then you see that tension. But what I've noticed is once you start probing and you hand over that responsibility for governance to the DRI, the directly responsible individual, and you ask the engineer, okay, have you looked at the privacy policy? Have you seen if we can opt out of model training? Have you looked at whether they have industry certifications, whether SOC 2, ISO 27001, etc.? Are they compliant with data protection laws? By the time you ask them these questions, either they'll be frustrated and they don't want to answer them, so they're like, it's not worth it. It's fine. I don't need this tool. Or they will understand the kind of risks that you're trying to mitigate, find out all the information necessary, and see for themselves, actually, this tool, this third party is not certified, they're a startup. They're actually not that secure. There are other industry players that are more secure, and then you see they start taking ownership for those risks. So it's either they give up, which means your use case in the first place wasn't that critical. Otherwise, you would just do the basic compliance checks, or they do the compliance checks and it's either approved or they figure out that actually it's not worth using this tool and they move on to something else.
Okay. Okay. Yes. So I can see now that it's not so much as to law being a blocker. It's more as to, do you really need to build this? Do you really need this? To be convinced that, okay, we really need to do this. And if you're so sure of that, then let's run it through these checks. If it satisfies these preconditions, then we can know that, okay, you really, really. Otherwise, you can just find something else that really works and doesn't have to put you through the hurdle of building something and the regulatory compliance, the check boxes you need to check. Now, I know there's a lot of risk associated with deployment, with the use of AI and things like that. And for some of these risks, some risks are really non-negotiable. However you play the ball, you still have to deal with them. So what are some non-negotiable elements of an AI risk assessment that you would look into before any model goes into production?
That's a good one. There are so many, but I'll try and keep this brief. I would say the quality of data, um, making sure that the data that you're using and you're collecting, you're preparing actually represents the problem you're trying to solve. Making sure that, for instance, there's no bias, inherent bias within that data set, making sure you're not even breaching privacy laws by using a certain type of data. So if you want to do I don't know, if you're in the healthcare sector and you want to do a study on how many people could potentially develop cancer cells, and then you take a hospital's health records and you have those individuals' health data go into the training model. Of course, this is already a problem from the get-go. Have you got their consent? Do they know you're doing this? Etc. It's sensitive personal data, so the risk is even bigger. So I think just looking at the data that you're collecting, how you're preparing it, because if you obviously you will need that health data for that example of a study, but then can you anonymize that data? Can you strip any means of identifying an individual and just take the data that will point to whether a cancer cell exists or develops or not? So those kind of things. That's one. I would say definitely testing, model testing, making sure that you sufficiently stress test, because when you test models, you figure out whether or not they're robust. So what that means is it performing how it should? If it's not performing how it should, then that's already an incident, because if it's not performing the way it should, that means there's so much room for anything to go wrong. So stress testing is incredibly important. Also red teaming, like actually trying to do malicious things with your system or your model. I think it's really important that that testing is carried out so you can understand where the risks are and mitigate them ahead of time. And I think finally, two other things I would look at critically. One is still this one is post-development, one is pre-decommissioning. I would say post-development, making sure you have a feedback loop, because I think people underestimate the importance of feedback and the actual need for it. Where there are AI laws, it requires a need for feedback, right? So I spoke earlier about documentation transparency, making sure you have the model card, system card, making sure it's explainable and interpretable so people know what this does and what the risks are. But assuming something goes wrong, you need to be able to gather feedback from users or people who are deploying it themselves. So that's really, really critical. And I would say finally, something that's definitely overlooked is decommissioning. Who has the say for the kill switch, so to speak? If something goes horribly wrong, is there someone who can say take it offline? Can they do that? If they can, then what happens to the data? How are you archiving it or destroying it? How are you safely shutting down that system so no further harm is happening? So I would say, yeah, those are the four main things I would look for: the quality of data, making sure it's representative, testing, having feedback loops available, and looking at decommissioning in a secure and safe way if you need to.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That was very, very detailed and really, really exhaustive. Thank you so much. Once again, our esteemed participants, you can leave your comments and questions in the chat box so that we'll take them very quickly once our speaker is done answering the questions that I have for her. Then we can take your questions and feedbacks as well. Yes. Okay. Now we are coming to the aspect of legislation, the existing laws. Nigeria's NDPR, and I'm aware there's an emerging African Union AI continental strategy, creates layered obligations. Now, I want to assume, without considering that most of our participants on the call are lawyers. So how should legal practitioners advise clients on compliance, where there's a divergence between these frameworks, between the NDPR and the HEYU AI continental strategy? What would you advise for if you're advising a client who is playing at a continental level, but who probably has roots in Nigeria? So where would you advise that, okay, this is the path you take where there's a divergence, or what do you submit to when there's sort of conflict of laws kind of?
I'll give the textbook answer, then I'll give how I think it should work in practice. Textbook would tell you go for the stringent legislation, which is the strictest, which I don't know, stringent, yes, sorry, the most stringent legislation, and comply with that. And then that way you should be able to comply with others. So when they say, for example, data protection, if you comply with GDPR, you are more or less compliant with other laws, and then you look at the local nuances. So if Guide and Nigeria Data Protection Act tell you that you have to submit an annual audit report and you have to register with the regulator, that is the local nuance, right? But in terms of your baseline compliance, if you comply with GDPR, you should be compliant with the NDP Act. Now, and it's the same with AI, right? If you take the most stringent AI law and you comply with that, you should be good at the Africa level. What I would suggest for legal practitioners is get in the rooms. There are always calls for volunteers, join these thematic working groups, join these kind of webinars. There's an AI legislation tracker for Africa, and I will actually drop it in the chat. But these are the things that you can actively do, because one thing we like to do in Nigeria is write legislation, write laws, and then the laws will be conflicting with each other. So one will tell you do A, the other one will tell you do 1, 2, 3. The other one will say do 2, section C. So there's confusion. So it's difficult to even advise clients because you don't know which regulator will wake up and enforce their law, even though the other one is contradicting. So I would say be part of the discussion. If you really want to give relevant advice, understand how things are moving. Smart Africa has a bunch of has a roadmap for AI in Africa. The Africa AI Council was taking calls for membership to different thematic working groups. Those conversations are happening. and you can actually be informing the way legislation and governance will go on the continent. And even if you're not informing, you can just be there as a listener. You can see how things are moving, see how things are developing, and then be able to advise your clients like, this is the way the trend is going, this is what the law says. I advise you on paper have documentation that aligns with the law, but in practice, you also are aware that these kind of changes are coming and this is what they're going to start clamping down on. So you're actually staying ahead of the curve and not just relying on what does legislation say, because I'm not a lawyer. So for me, it's very confusing. And one day, one thing is true, the next day, two things are true. So I'll drop the tracker now on AI strategy readiness across Africa. And I would advise that you use this and other open free resources to kind of keep abreast of things.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Thank you. Oh, yes, I can see the link. Thank you so much. Esteemed participants, please, you can check out this link to track the conversation. Because two things I hear you say is, yes, if you're working on paper, going by textbook, stick to the strictest. But when it comes to what really matters, you need to be a part of the conversation. You don't necessarily have to even contribute. You could just be a listener. Just follow through. That way, you know what to say to your client. You know where things will be tilting. You know where, okay, it's about to go down on this in this area. You need to be ahead of that. And I think that really makes you a very profitable business advisor to your clients, because then they see that, oh, you said it. So, and then you can outright the I told you so thing. So, so yes, that's very important. So please check out the link and you can follow the conversation on how the continent is growing as regards AI governance. So I can see one question in the chat box. So I'm hoping that we have a few more before we end. So I'm gradually coming to the end of my questions with you. And now, how do you handle AI systems that make or inform consequential decisions? I know you are in the fintech space, and one of the concerns that's been raised over time is, I don't know if it's so much a thing in Nigeria yet, is as regards credit scoring, how how an algorithm is making a decision about your credit worthiness for loan, for all these other things based on data that is fed to them that may not necessarily have considered you. So how do you handle systems that make or inform consequential decisions as regards credit scoring, fraud flagging, from a data subject perspective this time around?
From a data subject's perspective,
Yes.
I'm not sure I understand the question. How do you
handle AI systems that make or inform consequential decisions? Decisions like credit scoring, fraud flagging.
okay, with the
Yes,
data subject in mind?
yes, yes.
I mean, the easy answer is human in the loop, right? But as you scale, how do you keep the human in the loop? So having that one, that resource, that option for such decisions to be verified and explained by a human, and knowing that if a human cannot explain, then your organization is going to be liable. So an easy way to do it would be to build in rules whereby if you see an anomaly or if I don't know, a certain profile is declined, it triggers a notification for a human to review, right? It's very difficult when it comes to credit scoring because this is when the intersection with or things like this consequential decisions come in. This is where you see the data protection legislation really take a forefront or front seat because if as soon as that decision that's automated can have an impact or a consequence to the rights and freedoms of the data subject concerned, you have a privacy issue there. So you always have to make sure you have a human in the loop, the availability or potential for a human in the loop. It doesn't mean that every decision that's automated has to be checked by a human. Otherwise, of course, then it's not automated decision making. But it means that you define the rules, you define the thresholds for a human review. That might be a spot check once a week. It might be a spot check once a day. it might be a combination of a spot check plus your configured rules that will trigger a human intervention review. And it might be that plus, if you decline someone for a loan, that person has the option to challenge that decision. So even in just getting that email or the push notification that says, apologies, your loan was declined or refused, then you should be able to instantly, as the data subject, click challenge decision, and then that triggers a human review. So I would say those are different ways you can look at making sure you stay compliant from the data protection side and you value the rights of the data subject.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. And one thing that you said has stayed with me is the challenge with keeping a human in the loop as you scale. Because as your customer base grows, how many times do you want to have someone, there's a flag and having to stop and check, stop and check, stop and check can really, it can slow down the process to a large extent. At the same time, you also kind of provided a solution to that. You have a system of like an appeal, that data subjects that liberty to appeal a decision and say, I'm not comfortable with this. Why was I denied? I'd like to have an explanation. At least that way you can now become more specific in addressing this particular person, but you can't address every person who is denied over time. Otherwise, you just probably have to keep it small forever. And I don't think any business wants to do that. Now, as the AI regulation matures on the continent, what governance structure would you advise that organizations today begin to look into to avoid costly retrofitting tomorrow? I know some already built, and by the time these policies come into place, there's a lot of adjustments that will need to be made. But if you're talking to someone who is building from now, and you're going to say to the person, I think you should be looking in this direction, so that you don't have to do so much adjustments in the future. What would those areas be?
Invest in AI literacy, and this somewhat actually answers Clara's question. So if you will permit me, I will kind of I'll answer a bit of Clara's question now. I would say build AI literacy, make sure you're training staff. It's one thing, obviously have your policies, because the first thing any auditor will look at is, do you have an AI governance framework? Do you have an AI governance policy? These kind of things. Do you have like maybe even an AI incident run book? So these are some of the, do you have a secure development with AI handbook, guidelines, these kind of things? So documentation, policies and procedures, of course, but policies and procedures are nothing without an understanding on how to operationalize them. So I would say definitely invest in AI governance training and responsible and ethical AI use. And that's company-wide. Then if you want to take it one step further, invest for role-based education. So what you're teaching your engineers about responsible AI will be very different to what you're teaching your legal team where it comes to IP, liability, these kind of things. If somebody, creates something with AI, one, could the company get sued? Two, whose intellectual property is it? So these are things that the legal team will have to think through. Security, they'll need to do things like, and this is something I definitely advise your security team, security operations team, should make sure that they are blocking anything that is not whitelisted, because everybody uses AI. But if you can enforce that, if you have company laptops, your IT security team or your security operations team can actually technically block you not using anything that the company has not approved, because that could introduce additional risks. So I would say look at it from the educational front, capacity building, look at it from the governance in terms of policies and procedures, and look at it technically, because people don't know what they don't know. So to a certain degree, you have to reduce that risk surface and that attack surface through technical controls. The same way you always see companies have role-based access control. Not anybody can just see anything or log into any tool as an admin. Have that same mindset with AI. And I think if you start with those three things, you can build in different ways and you can build on them and mature on them. But you need to have foundationally an understanding, which is where the training comes in. If people don't understand the risks of using AI, then it's a lost cause. Doesn't matter how many controls you have, doesn't matter how many policies you will have the whole company as the weakest link. So I would say, yeah, those three things are a great starting place for organizations.
Thank you so much for that. And to piggyback on that, for lawyers on the call, I'm going to once again refer to the three guidelines that the MBA has that we should really look at as lawyers. The MBA has guideline on the use of AI for legal practitioners in compliance with the RPC, very important. We have guidelines on the use of cybersecurity and guidelines on the deployment of technology in your legal practice. These are very handy documents that you should, it's part of building knowledge. It's not just for you, it's for all the lawyers who work in your law firm, it's for you as you interact with your clients as well, so that you're within the purview of not just the law, but also what the RPC provides, especially as it regards to our practice as legal practitioners. And also, going from what Ms. Akerele said, it might also be very important for law firms to have a policy on bringing your own device, on using individual devices because I know for some law firms, staffs you work with your own device. That's an additional risk that's been introduced into the practice because you're intervening with documents with confidential information, and you don't know what's storing what. So if you're going to have people bringing in their devices to work, then you should have a policy, and that's on the side of technical. You should have some of these guidelines in place to know what comes into the office and what has access to what information. Now, so far I've had a really, really, really enjoyable session. It's not going to be a long one, because we also want to give back our speaker the rest of our day. I know she's had a really, really full day. So my last question to her before I take the few questions I can see in the chat box is, what is one governance failure you see most consistently in organizations adopting AI, and how to correct it, and how it is best corrected?
I'll speak from personal experience. And then I'll speak to what I see organizations doing. What I see organizations doing as a failure is not governing and not taking it seriously and not investing in AI experts, because in this age of vibe coding, anybody thinks they can build anything, but you still need somebody with subject matter expertise to guide on what secure development with AI looks like. You also need someone with subject matter expertise to advise on how to govern AI. So it's not a blocker and it's not restricting innovation, but it is also allowing engineers or developers or whoever to build responsibly and securely with AI. Now, what I have learned from my mistakes is, because I know a lot of companies don't take it seriously, and a lot of companies don't really see AI governance as a real thing, especially because there are not so many laws around it, and it's very difficult to regulate technology. I took a very hardliner approach, which was we should not be using AI until we have securely protected the company to use it responsibly, or we've reduced as many risks as possible. That was an instant blocker to innovation and to building and developing with AI, which birthed two separate tracks of people who ignored the guardrails and just built and developed with AI, or were using AI to boost productivity even though they knew it hadn't been approved, that tool or whatever. Then about the second set of people who were so scared to do anything with AI because they didn't want to put the company at risk. So that was a huge learning curve for me, because that's why I can now confidently say if there's personal data, because some people didn't hear those parts. So they thought don't use AI at all, as opposed to don't put personal data in AI, right? So just now revising the approach and making sure people know that you can use AI. It's fine to use AI. Just stick to no personal data, no proprietary data. And if you use 1 and 2, make sure it's on an enterprise version and log it in the AI inventory list. So those kind of things came, but it's such a new space. And obviously, this is a journey that's happened over the past few years. So I can look back at how I started my approach and see where the mistakes were made. But it's part of the experience. You will be coming up against people who don't see the need for governance, which is why I also mentioned earlier, start with leadership buy-in. Look at the stakeholders who are using AI, who are passionate about AI, who are doing cool things with AI, and just get them on board in terms of, oh, we could do more, but we just need to make sure the governance is in place. So I would say the biggest mistake is companies who don't do anything and think they can just plug and play AI into their operations without understanding the risks and without having guardrails. And then being too hard and rigid with your approach to governance, which is a turn off and a red flag for a lot of product guys. So making sure that you balance the need for governance with the need for innovation as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So there has to be a balance between governance and innovation. We don't want to have people who are too scared to use technology because that's actually a common fear among lawyers. You see concern about, oh, should we touch AI? Should we not use it? Should we, especially once you talk of AI is coming to take your job. Most lawyers are like, no, 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 I want to protect my job. We don't want AI here, but it's come to stay. And what really matters is governance. The structure has to be in place, a framework for the deployment, the adoption, advisory on AI has to be in place. There's this question from Balkisu Usman Yaro that was posted earlier. Good afternoon, everyone. My question is, given Africans' current, given Nigeria's current reliance on sector-specific regulations and general legal principles rather than a dedicated AI law, what do you consider the most significant legal risk for organizations deploying AI systems today? And which aspects should Nigerian policymakers prioritize when developing a future AI regulatory framework?
That was a long. What was the first question?
Okay, so
It's a
the first
two-part
part is what do
question.
you consider the most significant legal risk for organizations deploying AI systems today?
That's a good one. I would say, I would say reputation, business reputation. I would say business reputation from doing something wrong with AI, but also I would say non-compliance with complex laws and regulations that aren't really clear on how to be compliant because like the question said, there's no overarching AI law. So as a lawyer, that means you have to look at all the different laws, especially if it's
Mhm.
sectoral industry laws, to to scan for any reference of AI and make sure you're interpreting that and advising the business on how to interpret that correctly. So I think, and then of course you have extra territorial depending on if your company or your client is operating on a global scale or even on a continental scale. You then have to look at all the sectoral, all the potential ways that AI has been mentioned in various different legislations internationally and making sure that you're able to advise them based on that because what's difficult is that this concept of harm and liability. You see in America, for instance, AI is not considered a product, so you can't really say there's there's liability because you could only get liability in some cases if it's a product that's caused you harm, right? The EU has taken a different approach. So I don't know what the approach is so far in Africa. I don't know if we've even gotten down to that nitty gritty, but just understanding what the potential liability is and if liability can come from maybe consumer protection laws. So understanding how to interpret the significance or the effect and impact of an AI product where the law is silent. I would say that's a huge legal risk. And I'm not a lawyer, so thankfully that's not my problem. But understanding what non-compliance is outside of the letter of the law, can it be interpreted as this is non-compliance? Because if you have an AI product and there's a consumer and the consumer has caused harm, can they sue you under consumer protection, right? So And like I mentioned before, intellectual property disputes. So if your client is deploying AI, and let's say your client is a marketing firm and they use an LLM to design a marketing campaign for one of their clients, making sure that you as a lawyer have looked at that LLM and looked at what constitutes intellectual property, has your client changed enough of the initial, not prompt, but the initial source of the art or whatever, whereby that can be considered now original, or have they just taken the Mona Lisa and put a caption next to it, right? So those are the kind of things you need to look into. And I would say human rights violations, but I think that's pretty standard across most things.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. The other leg of the question is now, if Nigeria were to be crafting, developing a AI regulatory framework in the future, which aspects would you recommend that Nigerian policymakers prioritize?
I think we need to, this is part of the problem. We need to stop making policies. We need to like actually work on enforcement to existing laws and maybe actually amending what's on ground instead of making new ones, because it's very difficult to comply with so many things that conflict. So either it's done at a sectoral industry level, or it's done under um, data protection through a data protection lens. Let the NDPC be responsible for AI. Because what's going to happen now is not just Nigeria, and this is part of the things we're discussing on the Africa AI Council, right? We're so quick to have new regulators, but if we look on the continent and I'll speak specifically with data protection, right? There is a capacity issue where regulators are understaffed. And in some countries, they are not even, how do you say it without being, they don't have enough capacity both to enforce and to even necessarily understand some of the things, the impact of some of the laws that they're putting out there. If we have a new AI regulation, it's going to cause further fragmentation. We're already struggling for cross-border data transfer. If Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Mauritius, if they all have their own AI laws and then they all have their own AI regulators, how does that help digital trade, digital economies, sharing data? It just makes things a lot more confusing. When you're talking about cross-border data transfer, it's going to be even worse with LLMs. So I think we have to consolidate instead of trying to reinvent. When you have new regulation, you tend to have new regulators. Who do you think is paying for these new regulators to exist? The taxpayers. So, what is the problem that is trying to be solved? Regulating AI. Is there an existing body that can regulate AI? Maybe it's an addition to like how Guide came out and it was the implementation directive to the NDP Act, not a whole nother data protection legislation. It clarified what was put in the NDP Act. So is there a way that maybe NCC or whoever, Ministry of Communications, can amend? And I know that's what they did with the Digital Economies Bill. I believe there was a section on AI there. I would say the most important thing for policymakers to do in Nigeria is to stop over-regulating and to actually understand what are the gaps, what are the problems, what are companies unsure of, what is the issue with AI, and is it something that is specific to Nigeria or is it something that is specific to Africa? Is it that there's bias in LLMs where we're not capturing African voices, African context? That's what you should be looking to write policies on and join together as a continent or as a regional bloc, ECOWAS, East Africa, whatever, and solve that, not having a new AI law in Nigeria that is just going to it's going to hurt businesses that are trying to innovate even further. And it's going to, again, be difficult for then foreign investment to come because there are going to be laws that they have to comply with that may hinder their ability to share data up and down for the purpose of model training, etc.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I mean, there was a lot packed in that, but principally, I can see that you're not in favor of an AI regulation or framework. What you're saying is, let's look at what we have. Let's look at the gaps. Let's fill it. And I like the part where you mentioned the fact that if there's a new law, there's going to be a new regulator. And then who's going to pay? Then you have new fees, new levies, new licenses, it's going to be new everything here and there. And then it becomes, business becomes onerous for those who want to do business, because now you have like a literal textbook of compliance. Just keep complying and complying. And then at the end of the day, we're still falling short in the area of enforcement. So why not just look at what we have? Let's plug the holes that exist in it, and let's make it work, both in Nigeria and and on the continent, because of concerns around cross-border data transfer that is already onerous as it is, so that we don't make it harder than what it is already. Thank you so much for that. And yes, I can see all the comments in the chat box. Thank you all for enjoying this session. We're gradually coming to a close. I want to believe that you answered there was a question, I think Clara's question at some point. Yes. Given your experience in the fintech space, how are you able to prioritize building AI capacity through LLM training while ensuring compliance with privacy and data regulations? I think you touched on that, but I don't know if you have anything more you'd like to say.
I didn't actually fully answer it. So maybe Clara can clarify the question, because you're saying building AI capacity through LLM training. Maybe I'm not sure I understood that question. Is it AI capacity for AI literacy within the company, or using AI and training LLMs on our data? Because we don't do that.
Okay, so Clara, if you're still on the call, before we close, you can just provide a clarification on that now. Ms. Akerele, so while we're wrapping up, we're preparing to wrap up already. So as we're wrapping up, do you have any final thoughts, final comments you'd like to share with our participants?
I would say AI is the future, right? There's not, like, I used to be very scared of AI. I still am to a degree, because I think if things can go wrong without AI, things can go catastrophically wrong with AI. But I think you have to understand AI. And when I say understand, I mean play around with it yourself before you can govern it. You don't have to be tech savvy. You don't have to be able to code or anything like that, but just start using AI in your day-to-day to make things more efficient, to automate certain processes, etc. And when you do that, you'll become a strategic partner to businesses, to clients, so you can figure out how to govern securely without being scared per se. So I would really, really recommend you start playing around, get Gemini, get Claude enterprise version or paid version, and just start taking free courses, watch YouTube videos, and understand AI, so you're not coming from a very rigid lens, because the law is not going to help with AI. So even if you read all the laws that exist on AI, I don't know if you're aware, I'm sure most of you are, but the EU AI Act now, they're delaying now for high risk systems, they're delaying enforcement, and they're giving it another 2 to 3 years for companies to comply, because it's impossible. You can't regulate technology like that. It hasn't really been done before. So it's new for everyone. It's new for regulators, it's new for lawyers, it's new for consumers, it's new for developers, but it's new for everyone. So I would say don't be scared, and really just test it out in a low risk, low stakes environment, so you can understand how useful it is in order for you to then implement governance.
Yes, I very much agree with that. Would encourage our participants, you don't have to, it's not taking your job. Actually, it's going to improve your productivity. So you can get some of these AI tools, just play around with them, get curious about how it works, be a part of the conversation, follow the conversation at the national level, at the continental level, you don't have to say so much. You can just listen in, you know. It also helps you to know how to structure your advisory when you are having to advise clients. It also helps you to know where the world is tilting towards. Pursue literacy at all costs. attend sessions, take, I know Claude has like a skill jar where you can take free trainings on how to use Claude for several things. Some of these, I know Google also has a similar thing. So these are courses you can take, they are open source courses that you can take online and just learn, watch YouTube videos, get curious. I think that's the thing. Let's get curious together about because it's come to stay. We can't live under the rock. We can't bury our heads in the sand and hope that it goes away someday. No, it's not going away. So we have to get comfortable with it. We have to get really used to it. And thank you so much to the 265 persons who took time out of yes, who took time out of their Thursday to join us today. We do this every Thursday from 2 p.m. and we are here with several interesting subjects. Today's session is hosted by our technology subcommittee. And we hope that we have something else from our media subcommittee next week. We hope that you join us again. Take the time to join us again. Our sessions are not always free. Take note, but to enjoy the sessions free, you'll see the link in the chat box. You can become a member of the MBA section on legal practice. You're joining for just a token, and then you have access to all of these webinars for free. Today's session is free. We're just using that to tell you next Thursday might not be free, so you can join us. And to Ms. Toulu Akerele, thank you so much. It's been a very, very exciting conversation. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our participants have gotten so much value for their time too. And yes, we'll be back, and I hope to really get to see you and let's talk with you after here. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for having me. I'm so sorry. I had one last thing to say, which I almost forgot.
Okay, please go ahead.
AI with lawyers, if anything, you're part of the few where your job is not under threat because AI hallucinates like crazy when it comes to legal interpretation and advice. AI is fantastic for summarizing laws and giving you the key takeaways, but when it comes to interpreting the law and giving legal advisory, AI cannot do that. And in fact, it's one of the things you always warn for basic AI governance. Do not ask ChatGPT for legal advice. Do not ask LLMs for legal advice. So use that to your advantage. Yes, someone can summarize a law with an LLM, but they cannot give legal advice because lawyers are something else. So always bear that in mind and use that as your strength, as your trump card. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So yes, we're winning somewhere. So so thank you. So thank you so much for that. And yes, on this note, please, esteemed seniors and colleagues, we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much. And we hope to see you next Thursday. Thank you. And bye-bye.